Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So here I am outside Benny Hill's house in London. I think which street is this one? I don't remember actually. But anyway, Hyde Park is just that away. There you go. So Benny Hill was one of the most popular comedians of the United Kingdom in the late 20th century. His name was actually Alfred Hill. He was born in Southampton in 1924 into a lower middle class family. His father was a shopkeeper. Both Hill's dad and granddad had been clowns in the circus. So he had a couple of siblings, but I don't think he was terribly close to them. So he went to school. He left in his early teens, as was typical for the time. Higher education was very limited in those days, for very few people. And he did a variety of jobs. So he was a shop assistant, he was a milkman, which famously he wrote about in that song from about 1970, Ernie, who drove the fastest milk cart in the West. And he worked in building for a while. Then he got his first foot in the door of theatre, working in a revue, but he was more like kind of organising things and setting out the stage rather than actually performing, but eventually getting into performing. So revue, spelled R-E-V-U-E, is originally a uniquely British form of entertainment, and so there'll be an hour-long performance, roughly, occasionally with an interval. And there will be a number of scenes which are tenuously connected by some overall narrative that threads through them. And it'll be comedic in nature. It'll be deliberately overstated, sometimes stilted, melodramatic. There'll be lots of impersonations and things like that. That's why there's Cambridge Review that Footlights does every year. Anyway, so then it was time for national service. The Second World War was on, 1942. He was in the army as a mechanic. I don't know which regiment he was in, but then later we went to Normandy during D-Day, not actually on D-Day, sometime later, mainly to manage logistics, because that was obviously a big headache. There was only one port they had control of and one pipeline, Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. So he was in the entertainment corps by the end of the war, because the army had seen that's where his real talent lay, because he was a funny man. He had just endlessly fertile mind. He was always coming up with quips. He was a gifted impressionist. He could portray all sorts of characters. He was a wordsmith. So, and then he went into theatre for the rest of his life, and he remained a performer all the rest of his life. This is what he would do at this time point, no doubt. So Benny Hill, he got well known through theatre, through radio, and by the 60s he's on television. He appeared in several films. He's got a cameo in The Italian Job, Those Magnificent Men in Their Flying Machines, which is set before the First World War, about various aviators and one aviatrix. It's a fictive air race. I think it's from London to Paris or something like that, or Paris or somewhere else. Quite popular at that time. And Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which is sort of a skit on 007, because Dr. No, the first Bond film, came out about 1962. So there are lots of parodies of it. Later he used to claim to be 0017, reporting from Moscow, as in the klutz cousin of James Bond. Not literally cousin, but you get the idea, a takeoff of the genre. Because he was average height, he was always tubby, reasonably good looking man apart from that. Presented himself well, always tidily dressed and clean shaven. So he had difficulty forming relationships with women. He twice proposed, but neither of these ladies became affianced to him. So it was a bit lonely like that. He had no children, but he obviously wasn't short of a few pennies. When he died, he had over £7 million in the bank. That's in 1992 prices. So he was also parsimonious. Why was he so tight-fisted? He'd known relatively straitened times in the 1930s, as a child of the Great Depression. But, he was a multi-millionaire by the time he was middle-aged. So he was too mean with himself. And he was a travel addict. He'd been to every Western European country and quite a few countries besides. He acquired mastery of French completely autodidactically, and he was smattering of German, Spanish, Italian and Dutch. And some of his scenes were set abroad. He liked to send up national stereotypes, and I can't remember that very leggy, glamorous blonde who was part of his show in the early 70s, her playing the castanets and doing Spanish dancing and pretending to be on holiday in Spain and things like that. He had other comedy skits about the Cold War, the Soviet zone or the American zone of Berlin, and would have come this way or that way within one room, things like that. And various gags about the Second World War. Colditz was this camp where the British escapers were held in Germany. So there was Coal Pits in the UK, this fictive prisoner of war camp for Germans who kept escaping. Anyway, and then they're sort of speaking in mock stage German. Ich denke, dass die Colonel ist ein großer Puff, and things like that. So he wasn't afraid to include homophobia as the butt of his jokes. Well, that was the base of the joke. He wasn't ridiculing homophobia. It was the gays he was ridiculing. But in the 60s and 70s, that would be considered an entirely fair game sort of thing to do. So he composed lots of songs, and the lyrics are often incredibly witty, and they rhyme very well. And he would sometimes ridicule our notion that the Middle Ages was somehow glamorous or chivalrous or in any way edifying. So yeah, he did lots of skits about a dirty old man and sort of who was actually touching up women under the table who slap him and walk off and things like that. And he liked to have a bit of a harlequinade, some sort of chase, this incredibly convoluted plot chasing around a park of he's chasing a woman and a woman is chasing him and a man is chasing her and whatever and things like that. But people say that this glamorized sexual harassment, but it was a very different era, the 70s. It was well before the Me Too movement and all that. But he started to go out of fashion in the 80s. People have sort of seen it all before. The signature tune of the Benny Hill show was Yakety Sax by an American saxophonist, Boots Randolph. I'm not really good at doing it, like like that. I'm murdering it, no doubt. But there's this fabulous German band, Oompa Band, Die Kirchendorfer, who do a fabulous rendition of it. So he didn't actually compose the piece or even play the saxophone, but that became inextricably associated with his show. And so he had his last shows made in 1989, after which he didn't get a contract. So some of the new comedians, Ben Elton, some of the left-wingers were leading the assault on him, felt he was an old hat, but also that he was sexist, that he somehow legitimized the molestation of women. Anyway, so that was the end of Benny Hill. It was lived a relatively reclusive life. He was one of those people who was very happy on stage performing, but actually one-on-one was more reserved. Perhaps he would find it easier to display emotion to an audience. There was that sort of anonymity, there was that detachment, and not so much on a personal level. When he was traveling incognito in other countries, apparently he'd strike up conversations. So he never bought a house, and he lived very frugally. I don't know if he had a car at all, and he always stayed at relatively cheap hotels. So a bit of a miser, really. What are you living for? But he was rather overweight. So he died in April 1992, and nobody came to see him. Nobody knew he was dead for about 3 days. He wasn't answering the phone, and they finally broke out the door, and he died in his armchair in front of the telly. So it was a cruel irony that he was about to be offered another contract for another show, but he didn't know that. I think it was in the post when he died. So that was him. He died in 1992. And death as a career move. Well, his career really took off after he shuffled off this mortal coil, because then he became a really big name in former Soviet countries, because a lot of his humor is non-linguistic. See, I don't think he owned the whole lot. One of these flats was his. And so the Benny Hill show became incredibly popular in the Soviet Union, because a lot of it didn't need to be dubbed. They could easily understand the chases. And then there was even a Russian comedy show like the Ne Benny Hill Ne Show, as in the Not Benny Hill show. And anyone with the surname Hill was apt to be known as Benny, in an allusion to him in the 70s. I remember, is it Paul Hill, one of the Guildford Four, was known as that by his friends. So that is where he lived from 1980 to 86. That's enough from me. Toodaloo.